For more than 1,000 years, Ukraine has existed in a constant tug-of-war between empires that tried to control its language, erase its identity, redraw its borders, and shape its destiny, leaving the world wondering if the country ever truly stood on its own despite declaring independence multiple times. Throughout history, now, as Ukraine faces the most defining moment of its modern existence, the question becomes unavoidable. Was Ukraine ever fully independent before this era, or is its true freedom only now beginning to take shape in ways the world has never seen? Ukraine's story is far more complicated than a simple declaration in 1991, because long before that moment, the nation stood at the crossroads of Europe and Eurasia, absorbing invasions, cultural pressure, political dominance, and economic manipulation from powerful neighbors who saw the region not as a sovereign nation but as a strategic asset worth controlling at any cost, resulting in centuries where independence was more of an aspiration than a lived reality. Even after gaining official statehood, Ukraine remained vulnerable, economically tied to Russian energy, politically influenced by pro-Kremlin elites, surrounded by unresolved borders, and trapped between the promises of the West and the pull of Moscow yet today. Through war, resilience, and an irreversible shift toward a stronger national identity, the question is no longer whether Ukraine once lacked full independence, but whether it is finally achieving the genuine, self-determined freedom its people have fought for across generations. Ukraine's identity begins in the ancient realm of Kievan Rus, a medieval powerhouse centered in Kyiv that shaped the culture, religion, and political structures of Eastern Europe long before Moscow even existed as a meaningful city. This early state established the foundations of Ukrainian language and identity, but its collapse after Mongol invasions created a vacuum where foreign empires fought to dominate the region and reshape its people. For centuries afterward, Ukraine became a contested borderland, where Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and Muscovy all saw a chance to expand their influence, turning the region into a geopolitical prize rather than an autonomous state. The Cossacks, who formed a unique warrior society, struggled repeatedly to gain autonomy, often negotiating alliances that temporarily granted freedoms but never secured long-term sovereignty. The most defining of those alliances came in 1654 with the Pereyaslav Treaty, which the Cossacks viewed as a military partnership with Russia against external threats, but which Moscow later interpreted as a complete transfer of authority. This reinterpretation allowed the Russian Empire to gradually absorb Ukrainian lands, impose centralized control, and dismantle institutions that had once shown sparks of independence. As the Russian Empire grew more powerful, Ukraine became a crucial agricultural and economic asset, making Moscow more determined to suppress local identity and prevent nationalist movements. Ukrainian language, literature, and education were repeatedly restricted or banned, creating a system where assimilation became a political tool designed to weaken any possibility of resistance. Under Tsarist rule, the suppression of Ukrainian culture wasn't accidental but systematic, targeting schools, churches, and intellectual communities to ensure that Russian dominance remained unquestioned. Many Ukrainian writers, thinkers, and activists were forced underground, yet these secret cultural movements planted seeds that would later grow into powerful national aspirations. When the Russian Empire finally collapsed during World War I, Ukraine seized the moment and declared independence, forming the Ukrainian People's Republic and briefly tasting genuine sovereignty for the first time in centuries. But this freedom was short-lived, because Bolshevik forces quickly swept through the region, dismantling local governance and forcibly integrating Ukraine into the Soviet Union, ending its brief experiment with NATO. Life under Soviet rule became one of the harshest chapters in Ukrainian history, beginning with forced collectivization policies that triggered the Holodomor famine, which killed millions and shattered rural communities. This was not merely an economic failure, but a targeted act that many historians consider a genocide, aimed at destroying Ukrainian resistance and breaking the spirit of independence woven deep within the countryside. World War II brought further devastation, as Ukraine became the battleground for some of the deadliest fighting between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Leaving towns destroyed and populations displaced, Ukrainian fighters found themselves in a tragic position, resisting Soviet control while also battling Nazi occupation, experiencing oppression from both sides without achieving true self. After the war, Soviet policies continued to enforce Russophone, encouraging mass migration of Russian speakers into urban centers and promoting Russian as the dominant language in education, industry, and government. This demographic and cultural engineering weakened Ukrainian autonomy, ensuring Moscow maintained political and ideological control over every region, especially the industrial East and strategic Crimea. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine gained independence through a historic referendum where over 90% voted in favor, signaling an overwhelming desire for self. Yet independence on paper didn't automatically translate into full sovereignty, because Ukraine's economy remained entangled with Russian energy systems. Political elites maintained close ties with Moscow, and the military was severely underdeveloped. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Ukrainian politics swung between pro-Western and pro-Russian leaders, creating instability that exposed how deeply Soviet structures were still embedded in the country. Corruption flourished, state institutions struggled to modernize, and Moscow used these weaknesses to maintain leverage over Ukrainian decisions, delaying any chance for complete independence. In 2004, the Orange Revolution became a turning point when millions of Ukrainians protested election fraud orchestrated by pro-Kremlin forces, demonstrating that the public no longer wanted to be ruled by leaders influenced by Moscow. This peaceful uprising showed the world that Ukrainian identity was shifting, and it marked the beginning of a new era where citizens demanded transparency, democracy, and a genuine break from Russian control. Yet Russia did not stop trying to influence Ukrainian politics. And by 2030, when the government attempted to block a trade agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Moscow, the people responded with massive protests known as Euro. These protests became a national awakening, uniting Ukrainians across regions and generations, and forcing the pro-Russian president to flee the country. Russia's response to Euromaidan was swift and aggressive, beginning with the covert invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, which violated international law and shocked the global community. Shortly after, Russia fueled separatist movements in Donbass, launching a hybrid war that destabilized eastern Ukraine for years and exposed the country's military vulnerabilities. Despite the challenges, this period triggered major transformations inside Ukraine, including a stronger national identity, military reforms, and a decisive push toward the European Union and NATO. The war in eastern Ukraine became a catalyst that united the country in ways not seen since the early days of independence, reducing Russian cultural influence and strengthening the Ukrainian language and civic pride. Everything changed dramatically in 2022 when Russia launched a full-scale invasion, openly attempting to overthrow the Ukrainian government and erase its sovereignty altogether. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine shocked the world by resisting fiercely, defending major cities, mobilizing millions of citizens, and gaining unprecedented global support for its fight to remain independent. This invasion pushed Ukraine toward a level of independence that previous decades never achieved, because dependence on Russian energy, trade routes, and cultural alignment ended overnight as the country reoriented itself entirely toward the West. The transformation wasn't just political, it became emotional, cultural, and generational. As millions embraced a renewed sense of identity that rejected centuries of outside control, Ukrainian language, once overshadowed in major cities, surged in daily use as citizens reclaimed it as a symbol of unity and resilience. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and young creators began reshaping modern Ukrainian culture into something bold, confident, and unmistakably distinct from Russian influence, further strengthening the nation's psychological independence. Militarily, Ukraine rapidly modernized through international training, weapons, support, and newly built defense industries, gaining capabilities that once seemed unimaginable for a post-Soviet state. This military transformation reinforced the idea that, for the first time in centuries, Ukraine could genuinely defend its own borders rather than rely on larger empires or geopolitical deals. Economically, Ukraine shifted toward European markets, diversified energy sources, and pushed anti-corruption reforms faster than any previous period, reducing Russia's leverage over its future. These changes helped Ukraine take real steps toward becoming a self-sustaining nation, capable of making independent decisions without external coercion. Politically, Ukraine's leaders became more unified around national goals, recognizing that ties with Russia were no longer viable and that survival depended on building strong alliances with Europe and democratic partners around the world. This alignment reshaped Ukraine's global identity, making it a central player in modern geopolitics, rather than a passive buffer zone between superpowers. Even with ongoing war, Ukraine's independence today feels more authentic and self-defined than at any point in its modern history, because it has been forged through sacrifice, determination, and a shared belief in national sovereignty. This struggle solidified the idea that independence is not simply declared, it must be lived and continuously rebuilt by the people who believe in it. Now, as Ukraine continues to fight for its territorial integrity and political future, the world witnesses a nation refusing to be pulled back into the shadows of empire. Instead, Ukraine is shaping a new chapter where its independence is not a fragile artifact of geopolitics, but a living force driven by culture, unity, and an unbreakable will to determine its own destiny. Ukraine's long and painful journey proves that independence was never a single event, but a centuries-long struggle against empires, invasions, cultural suppression, and political manipulation that repeatedly tried to reshape its identity. Real sovereignty for Ukraine has always meant far more than raising a flag or signing a declaration, because it required rebuilding institutions, fighting for language, redefining alliances, and resisting every force that attempted to control its destiny. Even after gaining formal independence in 1991, the nation remained trapped between its Soviet past and its European future, facing economic dependencies, corrupt leadership, and Russian influence that made true self-determination incomplete. But the events of the last decade, especially the full-scale invasion, created a level of unity, cultural revival, and global recognition that Ukraine had never experienced before, pushing the country closer to genuine freedom than at any moment in modern history. Today, Ukraine stands with a stronger identity, deeper international support, and a fierce national will that refuses to allow its sovereignty to be erased or rewritten ever again. The question is no longer whether Ukraine was fully independent in the past, but whether this historic moment of resilience and sacrifice marks the beginning of the nation it was always meant to become, and whether the world is ready to stand with it as that future unfolds.